that got me, as I started doing that research, I got really interested in how we have evolved from the very beginnings of the country to more of the environmentally focused directives of today. So this is part of that, and this was a very interesting era because it was really the start of a lot of different things. So when we talk about green today, you know, it comes up with all kinds of things. I'm not going to talk about the green like green as an envy or green as if you had something bad to eat, or even Kermit's little thing about it's difficult being green. But we're going to talk a little bit about how all of this moved towards the green movement that we know of today. So I'm going to start this off with a bit of poetry. Joyce Kilmer. He wrote the poem Trees, and I think probably many of you have heard it. The trees were really a very symbolic part of the conservationist movement because they were trying to protect those resources. So he was actually, he served in World War I and died, but this poem was written prior to that. And I have actually been to the memorial forest that's dedicated to him in North Carolina, where some of the last virgin timber stood. So it's a great place to see. The trees there are huge. It's just incredible that at one time, though trees like that were all over the Appalachians. I used to live down there, so I had a little bit of a look at that. And some of the lines like he has on here where he talks about a tree that looks at God all day, that was sort of the philosophy that was coming about. You know, we are told in the Christian faith that we are stewards of the land. Sometimes we were not very good stewards of the land. So the conservationist movement was starting to move in that direction and kind of look at the spirituality between human and the land. So conservation, by definition, is just to stop the wasteful use of a resource. And that of course included wood, because wood was the primary building source, but it also went into things like mining and other industries like that. And there were really three different values or three different philosophies that looked at how land should be used. And one of these is laissez-faire. And that just means that I own the land, I can do anything I want with it. And that included the mining companies and the lumber companies, et cetera. And then the conservationists were motivated against that excessive use of resources. And they wanted to come up with ways to preserve it so that those resources would be available for the next generations. And then we had the preservationists, which were one even step further than that. They not only wanted just to conserve it for resources that you would need, but also for public enjoyment. So those were the three philosophies that were influencing the time period there as far as land use. And a lot of these same issues we hear today, they still come up about it's my land, I should be able to do with it whatever I want with this, specifically when you're talking about municipalities and zoning, for example. That is kind of an ongoing philosophy. But we have a lot of things that have come out because of the conservationists. So, repercussions of the pre-conservationist era. This was a picture taken up in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, and it showed the clear cutting. So, with that, we know that clear cutting really destroyed a lot of different areas, like in the mountains of North Carolina, for example, there's places like Copper Hill that was in Tennessee that was wiped out. You don't see any trees there, even hundreds of years later after it had happened. So that was a problem that we were uncovering. So the conservation movement was both political, environmental, and social. There were things that came across all different aspects of it. And as we'll find later, it also influenced things like art. So it was also called the progressive era at that time, and that was because there was a lot of changes in how corporations should be held or companies should be held somewhat accountable for things. We hear the term robber barons. That was something that Theodore Roosevelt used in his campaign, and that was what he was trying to eliminate with the idea that you can use anything you wanted. Mining industries extracted like resources such as coal, iron, gold, silver, copper, and oil, and they used, at the time, they were very unethical, sometimes dangerous, inefficient ways, wasteful mining practices that were devoid of government regulation. My grandmother, her first husband she lost, he was a miner in Pennsylvania, and he was lost in a mine accident. So those unsafe practices were much more prevalent. Of course, now that we have regulations and things like that in place, partly because of some of this early work. And then the timber and lumber and logging industry, also the same kind of thing, destructive methods, et cetera. And then the railroads even. The railroads and land speculators purchased vast tracts of farming and grazing lands and forests. So that took a lot of that land out of clear cutting to make paths and things like that. So this is not the only, clear cutting was not the only problem of that era. We have the extinction of the species. 99%. In 1906, Congress did pass the Migratory Bird Act. And that was the first time any kind of legislation had gone in that time, had happened. So we have the passenger pigeon. This is a drawing of the last passenger pigeon. Her name was Martha, and she died at the Cincinnati Zoo. And she was 29. But that species here in America numbered in the millions, or in the billions actually, with a B. And I'll talk a little bit, one of my other points, I talk about the Grand Kankakee Marsh. Passenger pigeons were prevalent in that, as well as other birds and species. The other one is the Carolina parakeet. It's North America's only native parrot. And that once was all throughout the southeastern forests. And of course, as habitat was destroyed, probably also for their feathers and things of that nature, those species died as well. Then there is a species called the ivory-billed woodpecker. It was collected and logged out of existence. So a lot of times, of course, the fur trade, the fashions, the feathers in women's hats, all of those kind of things made a market for those kind of things. And if it was unregulated, there was no repercussions for overutilizing that resource. And then there's a bird called the great auk. It's a flightless, powerful swimmer, and it was destroyed for fishing bait. So there's all kinds of reasons that birds were targeted. And of course, we know from science that birds sometimes are very susceptible to changes in the environment. So things like loss of habitats or lack of predators and things like that can always influence species in one way or another. And also, it wasn't just birds, like the cougar, for example, eastern cougar. It was expatriated from the area because of a bounty system, because it was viewed as a predator. All right, so here are some other endangered species. 1900, the Legacy Act becomes the first federal law prohibiting game, protecting game rather. And then in 1902, Congress passed the Alaska Game Act protecting animals in Alaska. So there is the start of legislation in this era that was geared towards protecting some of the resources and the species that we were enjoying in this nation. There's a couple other things I want to talk about. The Soil Conservation Act was passed in April 27, 1935. So that's much later than the early 1900s. But if you remember the Dust Bowl, that was because the land was overused and there was no soil preservation efforts in place. So that was one that that is one consequence of some of the non-conservation oriented practices. It led to the creation of the Soil Conservation Service. So that was part of what happened there. Another thing I'm going to talk about is the Cuban mahogany. Here at Ruthmere, we have Cuban mahogany throughout the whole house. I know that in the library, for example, there used to be soffits up there that were made of Cuban mahogany that disguised the sprinkler system that was built into the mansion. But when because of need to replace those over time when they were restoring the mansion, they could not find any Cuban mahogany. And I looked up the history of that, and it was quite prevalent up through the 19th centuries. And then it was first exploited for shipbuilding for the Spanish, and then for the English and French furniture trades, such as Chippendale, the Federal-style Sheraton and Empire all used Cuban mahogany. But as late as the 1920s, it was still possible to purchase a sizable amount, but by the next decade, it was no longer available commercially. So this particular slide here talks about the Kankakee March. In I happened to, there was a video that was produced a couple years ago called The Everglades of the North. And if you can see here, was the original size of the Kankakee Marsh. It was really extensive. It had a lot of different species. It was called Chicago's breadbasket because there was a lot of wild game that was there. The water was pure and clear, and they had a lot of different species. It was that people would take trips there to experience wildlife there. Well, they decided that that it should be. It tells you there that they decided to take out the dam. First they decided to just straighten the river. So take out all the little curves and all the natural curves. And then they took out the dam over in Illinois, a limestone dam. And by 1917, only 10% of the marsh remained. And what you see today, the Kankakee River, that was what was left. And it's interesting when you drive through the countryside where the Kankakee River is, you can kind of see the flatlands, and you think, oh, this probably was all wetlands at one point. So that was something that happened fairly locally. And then also, unrelated to this, but the urban environments were beginning to change too, with a more focus on green space and parks, et cetera. New York Central Park was created in the 1850s to provide city dwellers with a way to get back to nature. We know that there's urbanization, there was inadequate sanitation, and that was pollution, et cetera. So the green spaces were considered a way to help alleviate that. And so there was like diseases and things like that was prevalent in those cities, but a park would provide a little bit of air. We know that plants can purify the air a little bit for us. So probably not to the extent that some of the cities were as they were growing in the 1900s. But so conservation actually came about as a science, and forestry was one of the first sciences in North America. Forestry, though, had been something that the British had been trying for a while in their colonies, especially India, so that they would have regular access to those resources. So some of the leaders in this was, of course, Theodore Roosevelt. He recognized that the laissez-faire, where people could do anything with their land, even companies, was really destructive because we were going to run out of resources if that had continued. And in fact, that was his political stand for his election. He was very environmental focused, very conservation movement focused, and he actually is known as the conservation president. And he said that the best thing was to maximize long-term economic benefits, not just use it now until it's gone and then move on. It was to find a way to continue that. And you know, the U.S. Forest Service today, which Gifford Pinchot was part of that. He was the first appointed director of the Forest Service. The Forest Service even today does have areas of land that they will lease out to timber companies, and then when that lease ends, they can't do that anymore, and so they grow trees in between. So there's a very hands-on management practice for the U.S. Forest Service. In 1908, the Roosevelt Conservation, he referred to it as a national duty, that it was part of what we needed to do in order to keep the country going and active. He encouraged the New Lands Reclamation Act of 1902, the federal construction of dams to irrigate small farms, and under his administration, 230 million acres were put up for federal protection. The lady here, Harriet Williams Russell Strong, she is well known for developing a system of dam structures, engineering dams in Colorado specifically, where one dam the series of dams along a river would protect them from failing, basically. So she was a part of that movement as well because of the engineering and the idea that you needed to find a way to control the water. So conservation, of course, just like any kind of movement, sometimes you had those tenets that go into the literature and artistic flavors and things of that nature. And that was certainly true of the environmental movement. Of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson and his Walden Pond, of course, that was very influential. And then there was also William Cullen Bryant, Henry David Thoreau, all of those authors. They were the first ones to talk about linking human experience with nature and finding that spirituality or that restoration of their soul in nature. And then we had European writers also, Coleridge and Kant also were they were influenced by the American Romantic movement, which is part of this conservationist movement. So when they celebrated the American wilderness in the 19th century, art, photography, and all of that soon became an icon of what America looked like. So you had landscapes like this one painted by the Hudson Valley Collective there, and it was interesting how they had different ways of referring to different landscapes. For example, terms like beautiful were typically for those pastoral scenes where the rolling hills and farm fields, meadows, etc., tended gardens, they would call those beautiful. They would call picturesque the more magnificent landscapes of the ruggedness, the mountains, etc., the canyons, those type of things. That was considered picturesque. And then finally, there was also the sublime landscapes, which were exaggerated. Vast caverns, thundering waterfalls, even violent weather. So they all, when they were capturing nature and in the effort to not only share their art, but also reflect the times and the appreciation that was developing for things like national parks and state parks and our landscapes, sublime would be those really, really things that could only be created by the hand of God. So from this history, we now enjoy a lot of the results. And this was a quote from Thoreau, it says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately." So that is sort of the concept of what conservationists were after. They wanted everybody to have that experience, but also make sure that it was around for human use, for mankind's use for the next generations. Here's a little bit of a conservationist timeline. I'm not going to go through all this, but you can see that there's a lot of things that happened. National parks were created during Roosevelt's era. There were different laws that were enacted. Different societies were started. You know, the Sierra Club had been active for a while. There were the American Bison Society was started, for example. So all of these things were reacting to what had happened before and how to prevent that from happening again. So from now, we can look at this and we can enjoy some of the results of that movement and some of the things that happened. National parks, you know, I think there's 60 now national parks, and there's even more wilderness areas and national forests. You know, Indiana Dunes was a national lakeshore. It's just recently, a couple years ago, got the designation of a national park. So that's close to us. That's the only national park in Indiana. There is a national forest as well. And then the ones like Joyce Kilmer that I mentioned at the beginning in North Carolina, it's a beautiful place where you cannot see trees that old anymore in the mountains. And that's a shame because, you know, the Appalachians, there's a reason why a lot of that culture was preserved for so long because you couldn't get there. But yet the mining companies found a way, whether they built railroad tracks up into the mountains and then just clear cut from there. So we now have laws, policies, regulations that are aimed at protecting the environment. And part of that started with the conservationist movement and the idea of robber barons, the industrialists that come in and just exploit the land and the resources. And also, it's interesting to note that in our terms of how our society looks at things like the environmentalists, for example, like in the 1960s, you know, if you were more oriented toward nature, you were kind of probably like a hippie. That would be the term that they would use. And now, if you say you're a tree hugger, everybody says, "Oh yeah, so am I." You know, there's a commonality now to the idea that we need to protect what we have. So. The conservationist movement, I did not know as much about this as I thought when I first started doing the research, and that's what's good about research, because it opens up all kinds of ideas. And I can see there's a lot of parallels even today that we still struggle with. We need resources, we need oil, we need gas, we need all of those things that make our life easier, but how do we balance that with protecting the land and also some of the traditions of the people? You know, the indigenous people, for example, there's sometimes those running a pipeline across their land can cause water problems or disrupt their spiritual lands. So we still are balancing. We're still trying to balance this. But now we have things that are stronger in place that can help us kind of get through these times. But we do owe gratitude to the conservation-minded individuals who had wanted to change that status quo way back 100 and some years ago.